Morning. Yeah, that sounds good. All right, we have a critical mass. It's just past 8:30. Originally, Layla Sadat was going to do the welcome because she is the chairman of the board of the American branch of the International Law Association. And as Julia mentioned yesterday, I am the president of that organization, so I'll do the welcome. Plus, I'm the former dean of our law school and current associate dean for global legal studies, so it all makes sense. There's a number of people I want to thank. First of all, we had a program committee that put together these panels, so I didn't have to figure it all out myself. And I do want to call out some of the members of the program committee that I see. So Michael Kelly, thank you for what you did. Paul Williams, together with Melina Stereo, who isn't here yet. Steve Petrus, and who am I missing? That was on the program committee. Steve, that was it? All right, I guess. All right, so you guys, thank you so much for helping out with that. As you noticed, last night was just a really great affair, and it was very well organized. You will see Eric Seiler. Oh, there he is. I was going to say you'll see him around. But Eric, can you stand up for a second? This is our unsung hero. He makes our events work. And Eric is assisted by a Russian former LLM student who then took over our US-Russia LLM program, which we no longer have because Russia invaded Ukraine. But Aleem is right there, and go stand up, Aleem. He's terrific as well. So. All right, and you met our new dean, Paul Rose. After Jessica Berg and I stepped down in July, well, actually in October, we announced that after 11 years, that was long enough. And then Jessica jumped right back into the frying pan. She is the new dean of UC Davis School of Law. But we did a national search, and we had a lot of finalists, and everybody kept talking about this one guy, Paul Rose. They said he is the best. So he was the consensus. They gave him the offer. He said yes. The faculty was overjoyed, and that meant that I got to step down. They offered me a year-long sabbatical, full pay, which was really nice, but I wanted to do this kind of stuff, so I actually turned it down. I did accept a 2-year reduced teaching load and no committee assignments other than international law. I thought I got the best deal. So we have a lot of stuff going on in our international law program. We started off the year with a speech by Andrew Cayley, who is the new lead prosecutor at the International Criminal Court in charge of both the Ukraine and the Gaza investigations and prosecutions. And this campus, like many others, is full of protests because the students are on both sides of that issue, and it's an animated issue that divides a lot of people. He started right out. He says, listen, I'm the guy who followed the evidence trail and indicted both the leaders of Hamas and Netanyahu. And I'm just sitting there looking around the audience saying, okay, how's this going to go? But then he really talked about hope and the role of justice in the peace process. And in the end, he got this long, sustained standing ovation. So afterwards, he came up to me, he goes, wow, your students and faculty and alum, they're so nice. They gave me the standing ovation. Does that happen all the time? And I go, no, that never happens. This is an academic place. People stay in their seats. And I said, no, that's quite extraordinary. He's thinking it was like, oh, I'm like awesome. And I said, yeah, but Andrew, we also have never had someone with such a nice British accent before. So, and then he reminded me of the Hugh Grant movie where Hugh Grant's character was very unpopular in London, and he comes to New York, and then he was like a quote chick magnet because of his accent. So yeah. Anyway, Andrew did a great job with that, and that's how we started our year. And then now we have this experts meeting, the workshop that the ICRC organized. And I want to shout out, how many of you, just stand up for a second, if you're affiliated with the ICRC? I mean, or I meant the ICRC, go, yeah, any US, international, anybody affiliated with the ICRC, stand up. Okay, there they are. They're all sitting together. You guys should get to know other people. But thank you. This conference would not be possible without their advice and support. And the American branch of the ICRC are our co-sponsors. And as Julia said last night, our other co-sponsor is the American branch of the International Law Association. There are newsletters out on the tables. We hope that you'll join. And we have this giant conference in New York in October called International Law Weekend. It is the second largest conference of practitioners and academics in international law in the country and the world. And our branch is 102 years old. It's got the most members of any of the branches. And so I've had a real good time as its president the last 2 years. I'll be president 2 more years, and then I'll be chair for 4 years. So I'm like stuck in that role. But today, it's really my pleasure to welcome you to Cleveland. I hope you got a chance to stroll around, see some of the museums. We would love you to sneak out when you're not speaking and go and enjoy the gardens. It is absolutely fantastic out there. The door is right around the corner. There are also indoor gardens. There is a Costa Rica rainforest with giant butterflies and a waterfall. Usually when it's snowing, that's the place to hang out, but it's not snowing, so you can go out that way. And also there's a Madagascar spiny desert with giant tortoises and weird lizards and things like that. I also wanted to call out, you probably noticed last night when the band was playing, there was the Cox Center's 30th anniversary banner, and next to it was the PILPG banner. And that's because Paul Williams and PILPG play a big role in the success of the international law efforts at our law school. So thank you, Paul, and your organization. All right, well, get to that. So we have full schedule today. There are lots of breaks. The idea is for everybody to get along, get together, talk about the issues that we started talking about yesterday. I thought the experts meeting was a fantastic start. We are going to do a series of Zoom follow-ups so we can finish our report. We should try to finish it by December so that it can be edited and included in the journal. Many of you have agreed to submit articles to the journal. Raise your hand if you're going to be doing that. It's a lot. And what you'll see on the tables and in those gift bags are what the Journal of International Law looks like. It's a really impressive journal. It's one of the most cited in the country. We give free copies to every American international law professor in the country every summer. And that's 1,400 people that will read your articles, even if they're not searching for your particular issue. That's one of the reasons it's most cited. Now, how many out there are our Journal of International Law editors? Raise your hand if you're one of our journal editors. There you guys are. You will be meeting our journal editors all day, and they're going to be talking to those of you who are writing articles just to touch base with you. Some of you have not submitted your articles yet. They're going to try to find out exactly when those are coming. And they'll stagger their editing. So the editing's already started. And, you know, to produce such a thick book, it takes a whole year. But you will be happy that you joined us with that. All right, so without further ado, I want to call up a special member of our faculty, Jim Johnson, to the cushy chair up here, and we're going to have a fireside chat with an actual fireplace, faux fireplace. Now, to start our fireside chat, this is sort of the general intro to the conversations we're going to be having today. And I couldn't think of a better person to do this with me than Jim Johnson. Let me tell you a little bit about him. First of all, how many of you already know Jim? Raise your hand. It's like he's well known, so I'm not surprised. In 2019, Jim Johnson, the former chief of prosecutions at the Special Court for Sierra Leone, was appointed by the UN Secretary General to be the chief prosecutor of the residual special court. And you might think, oh, Charles Taylor's behind bars. What can he be up to? But I hear from Jim all the time, the amount of work that they're doing. It's really exciting, and it's keeping him extremely busy. Prior to joining the Special Court for Sierra Leone in 2003, Jim served for 20 years as a judge advocate in the United States Army, retiring at the rank of lieutenant colonel. Sometimes I call him Colonel Johnson, and he's so modest. He's like Lieutenant Colonel. A decade ago, Jim joined the faculty at Case Western Reserve University School of Law, where he serves as director of our Henry King War Crimes Research Office. And for those of you who don't remember Henry, he was a Nuremberg prosecutor that after Nuremberg joined our faculty and was on the faculty for 30 years. And he was the first of the international criminal law experts. He brought me in, I brought Jim in, and we've continued the tradition. Under Professor Johnson's supervision, Case Western Reserve's law students have undertaken legal research for the International Criminal Court, the Cambodia Genocide Tribunal, the Special Tribunal for Lebanon, Interpol, the IIIM for Syria, the IIM for Myanmar, and in 2018, he launched something called the Yemen Accountability Project, which has 70 students volunteering, not even for credit. They just do it because they love the work and they love Jim Johnson. And they are preparing case files for the eventual prosecution of persons responsible for atrocities in Yemen, either in national courts or some future international court. All right, so we now know who Jim is. Let me ask you the first question this morning. Jim, tell us about how the 1949 Geneva Conventions came about, because I know Jim was around back then. Not really. Go ahead.
That's a great way to start, and my talk will probably take far less time than the introduction. But you know, Michael, I did for a moment question your judgment in asking me to kind of set the stage for the Geneva Conventions and the discussions that take place later. Because sitting right over there, you just pointed out a little bit ago, the experts from the ICRC who really know this stuff. And so I'm just going to try not to embarrass myself when I talk about the progression of the Geneva Conventions, where they came from, how we got from, and I'm not going to go back 75 years, but I'm going to go back 165 years to how we got to here today so that we could do the things and talk about the ideas of should there be more. And so like I said I'm going to go back 165 years. And so it all starts really with the Battle of Solferino in 1859. And please, back on the table back there, if I get something wrong, just shout or whatever. But I'll okay. And I'll try not to go into too much detail for time and again, just not to embarrass myself. But the Battle of Solferino, actually the largest battle in Europe in over 50 years, over 300 nearly 300,000 soldiers took place were part of this battle. 30,000, roughly 30,000, and I'll give figures throughout my talk, and they're always rough figures, but roughly 30,000 killed and wounded, 10,000 missing in action. And in the aftermath of that battle, a Swiss businessman, Henri Durant, was there in the aftermath of this battle, and he just could not get over, one, the carnage, but really the fact that there were no efforts whatsoever to provide assistance and medical care for these sick and wounded that were on the battlefield, that there was just nothing happening. There was no efforts from the armies, from anywhere. He tried to organize some efforts to take care of those wounded and sick on the battlefield, but more importantly, in the aftermath, he wrote his book, The Memory of Solferino, and in that book, he really recommended that volunteer national relief societies should be created and that they should have a special status, a neutral status on the battlefield. And to make a long story short, that led to the creation of what's now the International Committee of the Red Cross, and of course the very first Geneva Convention in 1864. And so, like I say, we're really celebrating back 160 years, not 75 years, but that was created in 1864. And over the first convention, and again, strictly dealing with relief societies, neutrality of relief societies, care for sick and wounded on the battlefield. Over the next significant events really came, although there was efforts in 1868 to add to that, the next significant time period that we're really looking at is between 1899 and 1907, when we're looking at the Hague regulations. And again, we're looking at, we start seeing coming in, of course, the Hague regulations are mostly known for means and methods of warfare, for how you fight the war. But you also started seeing working in this time period, you started seeing looking at sick and wounded shipwrecked. You started looking at that. You started getting into prisoners of war and duties and obligations owed to prisoners of war, and giving some status to prisoners of war that they didn't have before. So you start seeing that in that short time period. Then the next significant, if you move forward, of course, in the aftermath of World War I, we saw attempts at aggression, looking at aggression with the League of Nations and Kellogg-Briand Pact and such, but we're kind of on the other side. We're not looking at aggression, we're looking at the victims. And you saw the 1925 Geneva Protocol looking at outlawing gas, poison gas, asphyxiating weapons, and things like this. But then you get to 1929, which is the next major revision or update, however you want to refer it, of the Geneva Conventions as we knew it. And you're looking at, coming out of that, updates to the Sick and Wounded Convention, and of course, PW Convention, the new convention, adding to what was done in the early 1900s and creating the PW Convention in 29. Jump ahead 20 years again, and jump ahead to World War II and the experiences out of World War II. And this kind of gets us to where we are today. Redrafting or relooking or updating the new Geneva, the 4 Geneva Conventions that we all know and are very, very familiar with. And we're looking at, of course, Convention 1, which is, again, sick and wounded in the field. Convention 2, we're looking at shipwrecked, wounded at sea. Convention 3, very, very much updating from the lessons of World War II, the PW Convention. And of course, bringing the wholly new convention, we're now looking at civilians and occupation and duties owed to civilians and occupation. World War II, of course, saw the extreme devastation of civilians, civilian areas, cities, and so on. Occupation, issues of occupation at a far greater level than you'd seen before. And so these were the issues that were dealt with in 1949 with the 4th Geneva Conventions on Civilians and Occupation. Okay, that gets us up to 1949.
So let me ask, 1949, they negotiate the Geneva Conventions. They now have 196 parties. And yesterday at the experts meeting, there was a discussion about, is that in fact the most ratified convention? What states haven't ratified it? And my student, the rapporteur, gave me an email, just like you guys suggested, with all that information. And so I could tell you, which states, including Taiwan and several others, have not yet ratified it, and maybe because their statehood is under debate, and that would be controversial. But in 1975, there was an effort to expand and apply the Geneva Convention to some new situations in the negotiation of the additional protocols. The U.S. has not ratified the 2 additional protocols. Is that right?
That's correct.
Why?
Okay. Well, of course, taking the 2 new additional protocols, and maybe just a touch of background on that, and I'm just going to kind of touch on the reasons why. There's a lot of reasons, but of course, the 2 protocols. Protocol 1, additional to the Geneva Convention, which deals with international armed conflict, and Protocol 2, which deals with non-international armed conflict. Perhaps to give a little bit of background on that, the Geneva Conventions very much distinguish between international armed conflict, war between states, and non-international armed conflict. And of course, the protections in an international armed conflict within the 4 main Geneva Conventions are indeed much greater. Much greater. You have, you get into, of course, protections towards all of the categories of individuals that we talked about that are addressed in the conventions, and identifying what are considered grave breaches against those individuals. Why that's significant is that for a grave breach, there's a requirement in the Geneva Conventions to prosecute or extradite. In other words, to see that there is some accountability that comes out of grave breaches. For non-international armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions address it well, to the extent that for those in non-international armed conflicts, you must apply humanitarian standards, humane standards to everybody participating in the conflict. Duties of due process, some duties of protection and things like that, but a much lesser standard. The two protocols sought Protocol 1, international armed conflicts, Protocol 2, non-international armed conflicts, sought to expand, to take some of the lessons learned in the nearly 30 years that had passed, expanded those protocols. Protocol 1 on international armed conflict started getting a little more into weapons and illegal targets and things like that, natural dams, things that could cause massive damage and things like this. You started seeing in that. The U.S. is very much concerned really with both of them, but particularly with the first protocol on does it give the main objection, as I think I see it, is it giving status to terrorists or types of insurgents a greater status than they should have. There are minor issues with Protocol 1 as well, dealing with definition of some protected places, definition of other aspects like that. But I think the key aspect has to do, are we giving a greater status to guerrillas, to terrorists and things like that than we should? And that has prevented ratification of it. Protocol 2, the last I have, I hope I'm current on this, is that in the Obama administration, it was forwarded for ratification. I don't think nothing has happened, and many see it tied in with Protocol 1, I think. But the concerns about Protocol 2 could easily be dealt with minor reservations to the protocol, and that was submitted, a good number of years ago to the Senate for ratification, but there's been no steps forward.
And to some part, the fact that the United States has not ratified it hasn't been significant because the international tribunals have declared them to be largely or entirely customary international law. And the U.S. has agreed with most of that.
The U.S. has taken that position as well. When you look at the U.S. Law of War program, and I think we're going to get to that here shortly.
That's the next question.
But when you look at the U.S. Law of War program, the protections and the requirements of the additional protocols are very, very much weaved into that Law of War program.
All right, so speaking of that program, yesterday, Sandy Hodgkinson, at one of the last remarks, said the most important thing that we can do to clarify the parts of the Geneva Conventions that will need to be applied to new situations that didn't exist when they were being negotiated is to think about it in terms of the training and enforcement at the level of personnel, because that's the most important thing. So let me ask you, as a former JAG high-level officer, how is the U.S. military trained about the Geneva Conventions? How does that work?
It works in many ways and on all levels, I guess is the best way to put it. The Geneva Conventions require to respect and ensure respect for the provisions of the Geneva Conventions. And that is taken to mean, of course, you respect it, you comply, but you make sure that others do as well, to make sure that your soldiers, sailors, airmen, all comply with the provisions of the Geneva Convention. And so, yes, all judge advocates are very, very involved. I mean, the DoD Law of War program is at many levels, and of course, training is just one of those levels. We train down to the private, down to the soldier level, seaman level, airman level, all the way up to the general officer level. And it's a multi-tiered training. Training can be as simple as classroom training. Training involves scenario-driven training, practical exercises in their training for soldiers. For officers, of course, that training is even more extensive in the officer basic courses. In the Army, for example, now I've been It's hard. I don't want to date myself too much, but now I've been away from it been retired for over 20 years now. That's hard to believe. I've been retired now longer than I was active duty. But anyway, we bring senior commanders, battalion level, brigade level commanders, and of course general officers to the Judge Advocate General School in Charlottesville for specialized senior officer legal training that includes, of course, all aspects, all legal issues, but focuses very much on law of war law of war training. So we take that very, very seriously. And but I do want to take it another step farther, because of course judge advocates are very much involved in every aspect of operations, with judge advocates in combat units, down to sometimes the battalion, sometimes separate battalion, but certainly down to brigade level. They deploy with the brigades. They down to brigade level. They're involved in all aspects of targeting review. I mean, we could spend a day talking about the targeting review and to the extent that you review targets and the role of judge advocates in there. Weapons review. All weapons, I didn't touch on that, but embedded in the conventions is weapons have to be reviewed to ensure that they're for the purpose, they don't cause more injury than is required to accomplish it. Judge advocates, of course, are very, very involved, and civilian attorneys within all services are involved in that. So I've only touched on a bit of it, but it's at all levels of operations that both in training and in operations that judge advocates are involved in the creation and review of rules of engagement. I mean, think of rules. You always hear the term rules of engagement, and your first reaction is that rules of engagement are based on law. Well, they're only partially based on law. They're based on law. They're based on operational requirements. They're based on so much. But judge advocates are very, very, my role at both the brigade level and at the division level with 10th Mountain Division, I was actually responsible for the drafting and final review of the rules of engagement in our division to be submitted to the commanding general.
And I'm glad you mentioned the important role that JAG officers play. We have about 30 alums that are JAG officers right now. Several of them are very high up in the various branches. The new TJAG, which is the head of the JAG for the Coast Guard, is our alum, Rick Batson, and he spoke at our law school last year. And also the former head of the Navy Reserves JAG, which is a very large JAG, is our alum. And so for you students that are out there, if you want to do international law, talk to Jim Johnson about a career in the JAG. It's great. Now, in addition to all the training that our JAG do here, I know that Sandy Hodgkinson and Greg Noon, who's an adjunct professor at our school, go all over the world and train other JAGs in other countries, and they're all doing the same kind of thing. And that's a role that our JAG play as leaders in that community. So my question then is, would you say that the Geneva Conventions have been largely complied with during armed conflicts of the late 20th and 21st centuries? Is this a good track record?
You know, I would say when you watch the news, you would say no.
Or when we see what you're trying in your court.
When you see what we're trying in the courts, you would say no. And there's certainly a scale. When you're looking at professional armies, when you're looking at the armies certainly of most Western powers, you're seeing that. I think absolutely, because I think that they've taken, we just talked about the training. We've talked about the legal review that goes into operations. And so I think, yes, you have the exceptions. And you like to hope, the U.S. has, out of Iraq and other places, have tried individuals for violating the law of war. You go to the U.K. and Andrew Cayley, you mentioned Andrew Cayley. Andrew was, of course, involved in leading the prosecution and leading the investigation into several incidents coming out of Iraq within the British forces. And so, yes, I would say very much. But then I would also say that on the other side of it, you would question if that's true. And let me give you, you look at, and estimates are all over the places. But you look at, I heard an estimate the other day that said as many as 80, and I'm talking about both killed and wounded civilians and protected persons killed and wounded both at the time, but the aftermath of that and the destruction and destroying their homes and destroying their infrastructure. So the deaths that follow. But I've seen numbers as high as 80 million during the Cold War. You look at since the Cold War, you look at, Yemen, the numbers are up 375,000. And I was just told we're running out of time.
We're on top.
But so I'll keep moving. But Darfur, 300,000. I don't know, what's the numbers in Sudan right now, Paul? Sudan and Darfur. But, upwards to hundreds of thousands. And so you certainly question whether it is. But I want to give you a couple antidotes here just very, very quickly. And and I said it's what you don't hear about that you really need to look at when you look at the success. This is out of the UN News Service. And one of the quotes that I want to give is, let me see, hopefully I say the name correctly, but this is out of the UN News Service on a recent meeting talking about the 75th anniversary. But this is from Cordula Drogi. Did I say that correctly? She's the legal advisor, chief legal advisor at the ICRC. She said, every day, even the world's harshest conflicts, IHL is actually being respected in countless incidents.
Instances.
Yes, instances, thank you. Often unreported acts of compliance with the Geneva Conventions do save lives, preserve dignity, and ensure humanitarian access. And over the decades, there can be no doubt that the Geneva Conventions have saved millions of lives. One last little anecdote here. This is at the same conference said by the current Foreign Minister of Sierra Leone, and who was a former child soldier in Sierra Leone. I stand here today as a former child soldier forcefully recruited during a civil conflict that decimated over 50,000 of my compatriots. I wouldn't be the person I am today without the critical support of the ICRC and the international community. So yes, I mean, you've got it at both ends, but I think that the contributions of, they're understated.
All right. So my last question to really launch the discussions that will follow is this. So the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols and even some of the follow-up treaties were all negotiated at a time before there was autonomous weapon systems, AI, space travel, satellites development, and the risk of weaponization of outer space, the possibility of cyber warfare or the reality of cyber warfare, and then some of the new actions and types of non-state actors. So yesterday at our experts meeting, there was a discussion about whether the old Geneva Conventions just can apply to these new situations, or whether it would be helpful to have some discussions that lead to ideas for fleshing things out, creating gloss, creating nuance, creating more information to help the soldiers when they're being trained know how the old law applies to the new situations. So let me just ask you to set the stage. What are the areas that you think would really be, helped by this kind of effort of trying to create, a little more detail and clarity to how the old law applies to new situations?
Okay. I'm not gonna answer the question you asked.
Okay, go for wherever you want to.
Okay. This is like the other debates, isn't it? We're not actually going to answer the question that you asked, but at any rate.
And you're going to talk about dogs in Springfield.
No, I'm not, so. I'm not going to touch that. But we're really kind of looking at where are there gaps, and do we need something new? Do we need revised? And I'm going to address it because that's what we're here today. The next four panels are going to talking about those. So I'm going to reserve judgment on that till I hear what they all got to say.
I think that's wise. Yeah.
But where I think there's a significant gap, and this is more down my alley, so to speak, is, of course, in the enforcement. And I think that we have significant gaps in accountability and enforcement. And that's my concern. You look at that we've had great successes in the last 30 years in accountability and in prosecutions with the ad hoc tribunals, the creation of the ICC and things like that. But look at the conflicts around today that we don't have the enforcement capability in. And so I think that that's where, from my perspective, the biggest gaps are enforcement in what we have.
Right. I think that's a great place to wrap up. You did what I asked you to do. You set the scene. I think we have, is it 15 minutes before our next panel? That'll give you a chance to freshen up, come right back here. We need to set up here with a traditional panel stage. And so we'll see you in 15 minutes. Don't get lost. Thank you, Jim Johnson.